Whenever you see a caravan of celebrity clout chasers, that's one of the biggest red flags that you could ever see because you know something that was authentic will easily be corrupted with, again, these celebritards when they get their hands into something. I mean, you can just go down the list of various so-called movements, organizations, entities that once celebtards got involved, you know, it got corrupted because they are assets of various corporate entities in which they're owned by. Even though when you're talking about these so-called black celebrities, part of their persona is to pretend to be the rebel against the man or the system when they're clearly the opposite of that. Because they wouldn't get these sponsorships that they get, and they wouldn't be employed by the various entities that they're employed by. Now, again, I highlight all of that to talk about this Colorado situation, but specifically Deion Sanders and his coaching, specifically the coaching of youth. And I only really started following this situation 9 months ago, solely because, I like the idea of what he was doing. Instead of whining and complaining like most so-called black people do, he actually went to an institution that doesn't get the attention that other notable institutions get, some HBCU school. And most importantly, he had his family with him, coaching his family, and being very positive and saying certain things that other so-called black people usually don't say. Talking about the importance of masculine role models in young males' lives, and also actually being critical of the idea of the single mama households. In fact, there was a whole criticism revolved around his talk about dual parent versus single mother households as far as when it comes to recruiting strategy. And so when he was speaking like that, I'm like, okay, maybe, just maybe, he's a rare bird that is a celebrity and that is so-called black, but is actually trying to bring about resolution. And then when I saw him get his family out of that JSU situation, mainly due to crime. I mean, I know other reasons have been given, but I've done a number of videos highlighting it was clearly the criminal situation that was going on at and around Jackson State that he was victim of multiple times. That's the reason why he left. And so, again, that was another sort of nod of, okay, I respect that he's not trying to risk his life or risk his children's life just so he could be seen as down with the non-existent culture. But of course, recently, I've been reacting to his recent little press conference where he went on this diatribe about, oh, how can you criticize me? You're criticizing me because you feel threatened by a black coach coaching 75% black at this white school, basically. And I'm like, here we go with this moronic nonsense. And again, whenever I try to give one of these idiot Negroes the benefit of the doubt, they always default back to that bullshit. And quite frankly, all that pro-blackity black nonsense, that comes from a feminine matriarchal mindset. Because, again, just like with females, particularly feminist females, what do all day? They blame men for their problems. Any issue, even if it's issues that they bring about themselves, onto themselves, what are they doing? They're always blaming men. And you have men who criticize that. But then those very same men, especially the so-called black ones, will then go and continue on that feminist matriarchal mindset, but they'll blame other men based on so-called race. Just like with that Somalian chick Brick story. Her out here scamming and blaming men for not protecting her, and specifically black men for not protecting her, her behavior and that mentality is no different than the pro-black male who blames the white man for every damn thing. It's the same mentality. And so when he spewed that nonsense, he just proved, once again, he's just like the monolith. You know, the monolith of so-called black people that are all in lockstep with blaming somebody else for their issues. And this dude doesn't even have freaking issues. With this guy's in his 50s. Most of his life now, he's been living in privilege and richness and VIP status. You know, and he's been able to have his children benefit from that as well. I mean, sure, he started off somewhere different, but he's lived long enough to where he can now say most of his life he's been in a different place where he didn't have to stay in the Jackson State type situations surrounded by crime and violence. But again, that blaming shit on black nonsense, that comes from that same poverty-stricken area that he was born in. And spreading that nonsense, just like every other one of these other stupid black celebrities do, it does nothing to uplift anyone. In fact, it goes against everything that he was claiming to stand for, which is to uplift young men. And again, especially when it comes to these athletes, you would think they would comprehend actually not making excuses and acknowledging the fact that you have to earn stuff. I mean, I went back when I used to follow sports. I mean, I did notice that every now and then you would see, you know, Deion coach youth football, like young kids. So I know this is something that he's been at for years, and he's earned this spot. But all of that, as far as I'm concerned, it gets thrown to the wayside when you go back to that default setting of blaming some other man for what? Criticism? Like every other coach doesn't receive criticism and harsh criticism. You know, again, the harshest criticism he's ever received is from these pro-blackity blacks that were debating whether or not he was a sellout for leaving JSU. I mean, CNN literally had a segment with Bomani Jones and Don Lemon discussing whether or not Deion Sanders was being a sellout for leaving JSU. And then you had that cartoon buffoon Umar Johnson on the Breakfast Club talking about how Deion Sanders should receive 50,000 lashings for leaving JSU and HBCU. 50,000 lashings, making a slave reference of somebody whipping him for leaving JSU. You're not hearing the critics of Deion Sanders talking about him being a sellout or debating about him being a sellout or deserving of 50 lashings. They just criticize him based on being a coach, just like everybody else has received criticisms. But when you buy into that pro-blackity bullshit, you genuinely believe that you're beyond criticism. You know, which again goes back into that feminist matriarchal mentality, because that's the same way feminist female feel. They feel like they too are beyond criticism, even when they do something wrong, especially when they do something wrong. You know, and again, the increase, because I know celebrities have been around the situation at JSU, which quite frankly still was a clout chase, but it's going to increase now with them in Colorado and with them now being 2-0. And to me, that sort of thing is just a sign of the utter corruption of what should be going on. which is like raising men, not raising victims. But you really can't have that mentality if your default setting is to always dig into that same crate that most so-called black people always dig into, which is blaming another group of people for their problems or accusing people of something just based on simple criticisms. But anyway, I'm just one YouTube channel. Most will continue to kiss his ass and promote this idea that he's beyond criticism. And that sort of thing, again, is not productive and is not helpful at all. All it does is encourage perpetual state of victimhood, which is why you don't see actual change. But I've come to the conclusion these Negroes aren't really interested in actual change anyway. And that's why I highlight stories like this, just to provide various detailed ways of how they're just utter stupid, basically. But again, there's plenty of pro-black channels that will cheerlead this nonsense. And funny enough, they happen to never get deplatformed or shadow banned, which tells you something about how much that pro-black nonsense is not actually against the system.